The love story between these two men was based on letters and poetry in the 18th century. Both were the greatest and most famous poets in France at that time. However, their relationship was full of unexpected twists and turns, sometimes passionate and sometimes violent. Despite all that, their poetry forever revolutionized the face of modern poetry. This movie tells the story of two poets named Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud. It is directly taken from their letters and poetry. In September 1871, a young Rimbaud sends his poetry to Verlaine from his home in the provinces. At that time, Verlaine is a well-established poet in Paris. Seeing his extraordinary masterpiece, Verlaine is immediately fascinated and impulsively invites Rimbaud to the house of his wealthy father-in-law, Mr. Maudet in Paris. Rimbaud accepts the invitation and makes his way there. Once there, he meets Verlaine's young and pregnant wife, Mathilde Maudet, and her mother. Rimbaud asks where Verlaine is, but Mathilde says that he went to the station to meet him. After Verlaine returns home, all of them are having lunch together. Verlaine asks Rimbaud how old he is, and he replies that he is 16. It is revealed that Rimbaud lied to him by saying he was 21 in his letter. However, the wild and eccentric Rimbaud shows absolutely no manners or courtesy during the lunch, as he came from a remote province of France. Verlaine and Rimbaud have a drink at the bar, where the two share their thoughts about Mathilde. The next day, Verlaine urges Rimbaud to publish his poetry, but Rimbaud refuses. He says that the only thing that matters is the writing itself. Rimbaud does not believe in love either, and says that it has to be reinvented. At night, Verlaine is in his bedroom, with Mathilde trying to understand the meaning of his poetry. Meanwhile, Rimbaud is messing around with Mr. Maudet's collectibles. He even barks like a dog at the small dog statue and breaks it for some reason. He then takes one of the preserved butterflies and puts it on his clothes. Shortly after that, Mr. Maudet suddenly comes back home and sees Rimbaud sitting on the couch. Rimbaud does not recognize him at first, even innocently calling him old boy. After learning the man is Mr. Maudet, Rimbaud simply tells him that he just broke one of his dog statues, stating that dogs are all liberals. Because of all his strange actions, Mr. Maudet kicks Rimbaud out of the house. He then informs Verlaine about it, and Verlaine is shocked to hear that. Verlaine immediately searches for Rimbaud and finally finds him sitting on a bench outside the house. Having no control over the house, Verlaine rents out a room for Rimbaud at a nearby inn. As Verlaine walks home, the naked Rimbaud comes out from his window and deliberately throws his clothes near Verlaine. Since then, Verlaine has become interested in the unique originality of Rimbaud's mind. When he gets home, Verlaine appears to be offended after hearing Mathilde's words about Rimbaud. As a result, Verlaine throws Mathilde to the floor. However, his actions are discovered by Mr. Maudet and his wife, who suddenly enter their room. At that point, it seems that Verlaine's sadistic nature begins to emerge. Later, Verlaine and Rimbaud go to the gathering of artists in the city. Rimbaud gets acquainted with Verlaine's friends. While one of them is reciting a poem, Rimbaud suddenly makes a commotion. He fights with the others and gets on the table to run around. Rimbaud also pees on one of the poems, criticizing that the artists in the bourgeois city are even more bourgeois than the bourgeoisie. Verlaine and Rimbaud return to the inn, and they kiss for the first time. The two also spend the night together. The next day, Verlaine arrives at his house and finds that his son has been born. He starts treating Mathilde harshly, but she does not let herself get hurt this time. On the other hand, Rimbaud goes back to his hometown and meets his younger sister, Isabelle, as well as his mother. He only stays at his house for a day to meet his family before returning to Paris again. Soon the 27-year-old Verlaine is finally seduced by Rimbaud's physical body. Both of them sleep together for one night. The following morning, a drunk Verlaine returns home to see Mathilde and their son. Apparently, he intends to harass her again. Verlaine slams the pram with their son inside against the wall and chokes Mathilde. Not only that, he also sets fire to Mathilde's hair for his gratification. A few moments later, Verlaine and Rimbaud meet at a bar. Verlaine tells Rimbaud that he actually loves him, but he also loves Mathilde. Rimbaud asks him to put his hand on the table with palm upwards. He then takes a knife and uses it to stab Verlaine's palm. Both of them seem to be enjoying how they feel about each other now. The two sleep together again for another night. Rimbaud tells Verlaine that they have to leave somewhere, saying he wants to see the sun. He feels that running away from home could make him happy. Soon both of them go to the wild and spend their time together. They do a lot of weird things, one of which is mimicking the wild goats. Rimbaud also runs into the sea with his clothes on, which is one of his dreams from long ago. 1 year later, the two have moved to Brussels, Belgium. One day, Verlaine quietly leaves the sleeping Rimbaud to meet Mathilde, who turns out to be following him to Belgium. However, Rimbaud knows what Verlaine is going to do. Mathilde finally has a brief reconciliation with Verlaine. Verlaine tells Mathilde that he abandoned her and their son for a year because he was afraid he would be arrested. Mathilde suggests that they emigrate to New Caledonia, where many of Verlaine's friends live there. She also says that it would be easier for Verlaine if he wants to stop drinking. When Mathilde leaves the room to get her things ready, she meets Rimbaud, who is waiting for Verlaine outside. Mathilde tells him that she and Verlaine have decided to live together again. Hearing this, Rimbaud confronts Verlaine in the room. The two quarrel for a while, and Rimbaud reluctantly allows Verlaine to leave with Mathilde. Verlaine and Mathilde finally board a train. When they reach the border station, Verlaine sees Rimbaud following him on another train. Apparently, Verlaine and Rimbaud have planned to run away together when they had a fight in Belgium. Because of that, Rimbaud boards the same train as Rimbaud. He ditches Mathilde alone in the other train and makes fun of her. A few months after the incident, the two have moved to England. After reading Rimbaud's poem, Verlaine wonders why Rimbaud chose to write to him, because he could never understand his writings. Rimbaud says that he has always known what to say in his poem, but Verlaine always knows how to say it. Sometime later, Verlaine tells Rimbaud that he received a letter from Mathilde's lawyer. Mathilde has applied for legal separation on grounds that Verlaine and Rimbaud are indulging in immoral relations. One morning, Verlaine goes to the market to buy a fish. As he approaches his house, Rimbaud says bad things to Verlaine from the window, even making jokes with him. Seeing this, Verlaine, who is not in the mood, takes this seriously and throws the fish at Rimbaud, breaking the window pane. Consequently, Verlaine rushes to the dock and decides to return to Belgium by boat, leaving Rimbaud alone in England. Several days later, Rimbaud eventually makes his way back to Belgium to see Verlaine. However, the two immediately fight. Verlaine apologizes to Rimbaud and promises not to leave him again, saying he was very angry at that time. The next morning, Verlaine gets drunk in a cafe after buying a gun. When he returns home, he sees Rimbaud packing his belongings as he wants to come back to his hometown. On the other hand, Verlaine have decided that both of them are going back to England. Although Verlaine persuades him to stay with him, Rimbaud insists on leaving him. At that moment, Rimbaud's psychological torture of Verlaine intensifies. An enraged Verlaine points his gun at Rimbaud and eventually shoots his left hand. The court suspects Verlaine whether he has a relationship with Rimbaud other than friendship. However, Verlaine denies it and says that he regrets his actions. After examining Verlaine's body, both doctors find that Verlaine has recently indulged in both active and passive sodomy. Because of that, Verlaine is sentenced a fine of 200 francs and 2 years in prison for sodomy and grievous bodily harm. In the meantime, the doctors are taking out the bullet from Rimbaud's wound. After the accident, Rimbaud returns to his hometown again. From then on, he feels very lonely, just like Verlaine, who also experiences loneliness behind the bars. Rimbaud continues to write letters and poems day after day, until Verlaine is released from prison 2 years later. The two eventually meet in Black Forest, Germany. Verlaine claims that he has converted to Christianity while he was in prison. He hopes that Rimbaud can follow his example to experience God's help, just like when he was imprisoned. The reason he came to see Rimbaud was because he wanted Rimbaud to find some direction in his life. Verlaine also hopes that God may help Rimbaud to achieve his aims, but Rimbaud says that he does not have it at all. Rimbaud finally states that he has stopped writing because he has nothing more to say. Rimbaud thought that what he did would make a difference and change the world, but he realizes that was not good. In the end of their conversation, Verlaine wants the two of them to go away together. However, Rimbaud tells him that he will have to find somebody else. This shows that their attempt to revive the relationship are ultimately in vain. Verlaine and Rimbaud part ways and never see each other again for the rest of their lives. After his separation from Verlaine, Rimbaud bitterly renounces literature in any form. It can be seen that Rimbaud travels the world alone, eventually living in Abyssinia. It is called Ethiopia in the modern day. While walking through the big rocks, Rimbaud suddenly stumbles and injures his leg from being hit by a rock. He then sees a boy in the distance, perhaps who would become his young lover in Abyssinia. When he gets home, Rimbaud's leg is being treated by his mistress. Several years after Rimbaud's death, the older Verlaine meets Isabelle in a cafe in Paris. Isabelle says that she and her mother want Verlaine to hand over any copies he may still have of Rimbaud's poems. They want to burn them for fear of the lewdness of Rimbaud's writings. Isabelle speaks frankly that a number of poems Rimbaud wrote in his extreme youth were quite indecent. Apart from that, Isabelle asserts that Rimbaud was converted to Christianity right before he died. She reasoned with him and prayed for him for weeks while he was ill. At one moment, Rimbaud asked for a confession from a priest. This is the main reason why only the censored versions of Rimbaud's poetry should survive. Verlaine then asks Isabelle what had happened to Rimbaud before he died. The scene shifts back to the ailing Rimbaud, who has a tumor on his right knee moments later after he stumbled. There is no doctor there, and Rimbaud would not leave his work. Instead, he insists on staying until the pain becomes unbearable. Because of this situation, Rimbaud plans to go back to France to treat his serious injuries. He designs a litter and hires 10 people to take him to the coast. Unfortunately, the journey takes more than 2 weeks for him to arrive in France. Before leaving, Rimbaud meets the boy he saw earlier. Long story short, Rimbaud is taken to the hospital in Marseille as soon as he arrives. Sadly, his leg has to be amputated because his severe wound can no longer be healed. Rimbaud lives in his family's house for a month, where Isabelle attempts to take care of him every day. For some reason, he keeps saying that he has to travel back towards the sun and that the sun would heal him. Nevertheless, his tumor grows into a cancer and spreads throughout his body. Rimbaud eventually dies at the age of 37. After hearing the rest of Rimbaud's life story, Verlaine pretends to agree to help Isabelle and her mother. Before leaving, Isabelle gives her business card to Verlaine, reminding him that they have to make a very careful selection about which poems would survive. However, Verlaine instead tears up her business card after she leaves. He then orders 2 absinthas, to which he has become addicted, and somehow sees a vision of the 16-year-old Rimbaud. Rimbaud expresses the love and respect which Verlaine has earned after Rimbaud's death. The movie ends with a young Rimbaud walking alone on a mountain range and carrying a white cloth. At the same time, Verlaine narrates that he sees Rimbaud every night since his death, proclaiming that they are both happy together. Rimbaud also claims that he has finally found eternity, which is the sun mingles with the sea.